And now, finally, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Alexander Peltzer, who works at Boehringer Ingelheim in Germany. Alex is a member of the nfcore team and will be talking us through using GitHub as a beginner. So if you're new to GitHub, you're in the right place. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Renuka. So as Renuka already said, we're going to cover a bit of GitHub contribution basics today, as well as some basic introduction into Git for very beginners. This won't cover everything, so it's targeted towards beginners in that sense, but there are most likely parts that we cannot cover today, because of the limited time that we have. So we're going to start with the basics of Git. Why is this here? Yeah, that's a bit odd. Basics of Git and GitHub. Then we're going to cover a bit of how I can actively contribute in GitHub, specifically targeted towards contributing to nfcore in this case. Then going over to some best practices, how to contribute and collaborate in a useful way, because this is something that most beginners struggle with a bit, and how do I actually start contributing to nfcore or other open source communities. And then we'll also reach out to look a bit at code review and do's and don'ts. What should I do when I do a code review? And what should I not do, ideally, if I do a code review of anything that is coming in nfcore? So to start with everything, I think most people will need to understand a bit of Git. So Git is a free and open source version control system. Most people know, at least to some extent, what that actually means. It's quite powerful, so even long-time users that deal with it for years still seem to learn new things. There are some very advanced features in Git that can help you organizing code or documentation in such a version control system very efficiently. But the basic features are actually not too complicated to use, and there's also graphical user interfaces helping people setting up Git in general if they want to. It's widely adopted, so it's mostly known as the version control system. There are others as well, of course, but I would say the largest market share currently in version control systems that are free is actually Git powered. Fortunately, that also means that there is lots of how-tos and beginner introduction courses available. So GitHub, for example, has a couple of them, but there is tons of material available to cover most of the cases and also explain things. Even if you just use a Google query and Git my problem something, then you typically get quite nice responses. If you want to know more about Git in general, there's two nice basic introductions that I have added here. So there's one here about Git basics and the Git how-to. This will be also available after the talk, so you can actually click on the links as well. So a couple of things that are kind of common nomenclature in Git is commits and repositories, or short repos. So if you're talking with people in nfcore, for example, they might refer to things like a repo, just point you towards one. So a repo or repository is basically a project where your code is stored at. So an example would be that the nfcore RNA-seq repository that hosts all the code for the RNA-seq pipeline. We have many of these repositories or repos. So for example, each of the pipelines has a separate one, but we also have repositories that host, for example, code for our web page or some documentation or some test data sets. So this is something that is a repository. A commit is a packet of changes that are actually applied to a repository. Usually that means it's a set of logical edits that are chunked together, and then I can actually commit them to my repository. So I add them into this version control system. Tree is the Git history of a repository. This can have branches. So my repository might have different sub-branches, which is kind of a way to organize code in the repository. So people can have a look at that later when I introduce some more examples. So that's just a very, very brief intro into what that means. So some of the basic commands here on the left side are listed above here. So we have git clone, which means download a repository, git add, which means stage changes that I already made, like adding a new file, for example, ready to a commit. Git commit is actually then adding this to the, more or less adding this to the repository with a comment. So I can actually comment on that. So I can say, okay, I added this file, which would be quite a nice commit message, because that means that people know what I did in this commit. Then I can also git push, which means push these changes to the repository. And if somebody else did some changes in the web, for example, on a repository that I actually want to integrate with my local copy of the repository, I can do a git pull, which will pull these from there. There's also some additional vocabulary here that people would like to probably see a bit about. So PR means pull request, and a fork is so-called a derivative copy. So I can, for example, fork a repository that is present on GitHub, for example, and make a copy for my own that I can work independently on. So for example, I can continue development on that and never come back to the original repository. That happens, for example, if people abandon projects quite frequently. But I can also use that to develop my own type of feature, my own type of, let's say, mapping methods, changes to a pipeline or something like that, and send them back to the main repository via a pull request. All of this sounds a bit more complicated than it actually is. So basic Git usage is something that one learns most easily if you do it, if you just apply it. And most people get along with just these 5 commands on the left side that I have as listed here as basics. But there's very excellent tutorials, even interactive ones, where you can actually train and try out a bit more complicated things if you want, apart from the basics that are covered there. Yeah. In nfcore, we use branches quite efficiently. So we have typically at least 3 branches per repository, per pipeline in this case. So we have a dev branch. This is where all the development code is and all the pull requests usually end up. We have a master branch. This contains the stable releases only. So only the stable releases end up in the master branch, because that's what Nextflow typically pulls. If you run a pipeline, then by default, it pulls the master branch of that particular pipeline. And we have a template branch. Template is something that keeps template functionality that we develop in the nfcore tools in sync, using a special sync approach that we've been developing in the team, using the nfcore bot approach. So next point in today's introductory course is GitHub. So GitHub is, as you might know from the name, it's a hub for hosting Git repositories. So a cloud-based Git repository hosting service, basically. Some of the users refer to it like a social network for developers. You can share and collaborate on code. You can interact on or with code, and also add documentation, plus a lot of other things that I won't cover today. So it's quite advanced if you want to do very advanced things. But in general, the basic functionality is very accessible and easy to work with. The basic account of GitHub is free. A pro account is free if you're an academic user or working for some academic licensing. Most people get along quite well with it, but the advanced stuff like continuous integration services and integration of Slack, for example, and other plugins, that's a bit more of a learning curve, and will be partially covered by an upcoming talk in the bytesize talks as well. So to have a basic overview about how GitHub looks like if you log in, so that's actually my login now. So you'll see some recent activity in the middle. You see some recommendations like repositories that you might be interested in. You see some notifications. It's quite easy to understand. You can even search things. You can find repositories or create new ones. So it's not that difficult to actually get into it. And as I said, the account is free, even if you're just using a free basic GitHub account. It's not too different from what you see here. The most of the functionality is available only if you're logged in, so you definitely need an account. The differentiation that is kind of crucial, and some beginners seem to have issues with to differentiate between them, is that these personal accounts. So for example, the github.com/apeltzer, that's my account, that's a personal account. But we also have organizations like nfcore. So github.com/nfcore is an organization which hosts all of the code for the nfcore organization. Multiple people with their individual accounts, however, can contribute to that organization. And that's exactly how we structured that in the past, to keep code that is developed within the nfcore scope in nfcore and not within just private accounts of individual people. Both personal and organization accounts, however, can have many repositories below them. So it's not limited to just having either one of them. It's possible to have multiple within each of these type of accounts. This is, for example, the overview about nfcore. So if you go on the nfcore organization on GitHub, you will see like this. You see that we have 61 repositories. We have around 230 people, 5 teams, a couple of projects, some pinned repositories. These are the ones above here, which are basically customizable. So you can change that if you want to, and all repositories. And you can even type here on find a repository, and you'll see that whatever you typed in will hopefully be found. The basics of how you can actually contribute actively on GitHub is following example workflow that I found on the web, actually, which is called fork and branch tutorial. It's based on a tutorial that someone else actually made. So I'm putting in a link here, and all the credits actually go to that person who made the effort to write everything down there. And this GitHub contribution basic that we're going through now assumes that you have a GitHub account and that you're a member of the nfcore organization. Otherwise, certain steps of what I'm going to display now are not working well. So this GitHub contribution basics basically starts with forking a repository. So imagine you want to contribute to an existing pipeline, which is developed in the nfcore hood, for example, Zarek or RNA-seq or the giga pipeline. Then you first have to start by making a copy of that repository, a linked copy, which makes it possible to later on also add pull requests. So that can be done using a so-called fork, which is then basically you can go on the web page of the particular pipeline that you're interested in. And on the top right, you will see that nice little fork button here, which you just have to click on, and then you have to specify where to fork this repository to. So in my case, and that's what people usually do, is they don't fork it to other organization accounts that you might have access to, but they actually fork it to their own private users. So for example, I selected myself. Then things are running for a couple of seconds. You will see that there's a linked copy made, which is also listed in the main repository here as a fork of the original repository in nfcore. You can actually start working on that. So after we made that fork, we can now make a local clone of that to work on this pipeline. So we have 2 versions of the repository now, the nfcore one and our own. And now we can working adding bits here and there. So the first step we will have to do then is, remember the basic Git introduction, we have to clone it, download it to our local machine. So what I do here is git clone, and I type the URL. It takes a couple of seconds, depending also on the pipeline size, and then you hopefully have a local copy of that pipeline available. That, of course, also requires an installed Git version. After that, I can just use an editor or whatever other tool I have at hand and change some stuff in the code and simply follow this approach after adding these local changes. So I'm making local changes, we can change them. Then we add the changed files. For example, if I added a new, let's say a document or a text file or an image or something like that, then I can simply add that to the repository by using git add. I commit these changes with a nice little commit message. Good commit messages typically refer to what I've done in this step here. So for example, if I added some images, I should probably have some nice commit message talking about like, I've added images that are used for documentation, for example. That would be a message where people later also would be able to understand, okay, what has been done in this specific commit in the past. And then I push these changes to my repository. So then I just do a git push, and this will actually copy the changes back to my own repository, which is on GitHub then. And the good thing about that is I can do as many of these steps as I want to and add as many changes as I want to in individual steps if I want to as well. And then these, the typical approach would now be, how do I make the upstream project in nfcore aware that there are changes? How can I actually contribute that back to the main repository, to the main project itself? So this is working typically in nfcore via a pull request. So I have to open a pull request. Then the opened pull request will go under code review, and someone will then hopefully merge my changes into the main repository so that my code or documentation or whatever I did to the main repository will actually end up on nfcore. So after forking, editing, committing, and pushing the changes to our fork, we can now open a pull request, PR. That's also some vocabulary that people often don't understand at the beginning. So we go to nfcore test pipeline in this case, we click on pull request, and then we can simply open, then this nice little interface opens up. We can click here, compare across forks, because otherwise our fork won't be coming up here. We have to always open pull requests against the dev branch. So that's something that you have to be aware of. Otherwise, you'll get a nice notification via our internal checking script on GitHub that will tell you that you incorrectly opened the pull request against the master branch. And then you can basically just click here on create pull request. That typically also opens up a nice little text editor where you can actually describe what you did in your pull request. And then people will be able to review what you did. And that's part of what we do at nfcore to ensure that no breaking changes, that no things are actually implemented in one of the nfcore repositories without proper review by at least a couple of people. A good best practice about keeping these branches apart from each other is that you should only have one conceptual change per branch. So if you add a new feature, for example, because you found the RNA-seq pipeline to be very nice, you found it to be very good, well working for your stuff, but you found a bug for a certain edge case. For example, some output metrics are not the way like you want them. Then the first approach would be to discuss this with the nfcore people in the Slack channel, for example, or on GitHub via an issue. After they agreed, okay, this is something that someone could contribute, then you can actually work on this in your separate branch, but only work on this in your branch, in your repository. Don't work on multiple things in one branch because that makes the review process extremely difficult. Reviews typically take time. So for example, if people have a look at your code, they will first have to understand what you did there. They will have comments probably, which means that you have to edit your code, which means that you have to add changes again. And also it allows other people to also work on multiple features simultaneously to you. So especially for the bigger pipelines, we typically have multiple branches, multiple pull requests open when people working, for example, on separate things. So for example, a new mapping method might be worked on while somebody else is fixing a bug in some other step of the pipeline. So if we have that all in one branch, that's actually a problematic thing. You don't want to see that happening. Especially for bug fix branches, these can be very tiny. So for example, if I just have a typo in the documentation, that is typically a one-liner that I changed plus some addition in the change log that I fixed the typo in the documentation, and that's it. That doesn't have to be much more than that. So in general, to summarize that, branches, small is good. The less complex, the better for the reviewers, which means that you also get feedback much quicker. That's a good idea to keep them small. Another best practice in code review, which is part of that, is so maybe I should start with first talking about code reviews in general. So what we do in nfcore, whenever somebody opens a pull request, then we check this code against the rules that nfcore has specified in the nfcore/developer guidelines. So for example, whether they are in the same code style, that the markdown documentation is in line with what we typically apply to, that the nextflow code is written in a fine way and not known to produce any bugs that we are aware of. The general rule is, and you can also check that in these guidelines that I just spoke about, that pull request to the dev branch, so to the experimental code, requires one review by someone in the nfcore community, whereas the pull request to the master branch actually require 2 independent reviews to be accepting these changes. So that's something that a lot of people are also struggling with, that they don't know about these rules, although these are, I think, written down somewhere deep hidden in these guidelines, actually. There are some nice how-tos, how you can actually do code reviews in a very good way and how to do them in an efficient way as well. So for example, one that I've particularly found very helpful is actually listed here. You can check that out. It's also free. And most of the rules that are written in there are actually also applied in the same way here in nfcore when we do code reviews. One of the biggest important steps in code review is that you should read things quite carefully. So for example, a lot of people are writing code sometimes over the night, for example, and are very happy if people catch typos and things like that. So you need to read carefully what documentation, for example. But also it's very good to use a certain feature in GitHub. So for example, there is a new feature, actually it's I think like half a year old. Whenever there's a pull request open, you can click on files changed, and you can go through the files that have been changed in that pull request and click on insert a suggestion whenever you click on a line of the code. So that would then open here a text box where you can actually suggest a change. That would make it possible later on for the person who opened the pull request to just click on accept that change, because for example, for this typo here, it would be very easy to just add such a suggestion, fixing JSUT to just. So that would be very efficient, and people don't have to write their own code again or go back to their editor, because they can just click on this in the GitHub interface and make things very quickly, or amend things very quickly. Another thing is a good idea if you do code reviews, you should always describe the motivation and the purpose of the requested changes. So for example, if you have an idea or you find something particularly interesting, okay, this is something that I know about, for example, the newest, let's just say you updated a mapper, for example, in an alignment pipeline, and that mapper has a known bug in a certain version and you know about it, but the other person who opened the pull request might not know about it, then maybe it would be a good idea to write that down in your code review and tell them about it, because they might not be aware of. That's just one example, but there are multiple others. So you should always describe why you actually suggest a change, why you think that something is wrong or not completely correct. A good idea is also to always have a look at the tests. So for example, we run certain linting tests, which are checking the code for certain code structure things, template things, but also checking, for example, the markdown documentation, like as you see here. So probably in the pull request that I just opened yesterday, there is a failure in the markdown. So the checks that we have in place actually failed. So you could check and click here on details and then find out what's going on there. This will be covered in a different session very soon, so separate bite-sized talk coming in the next couple of weeks about that. If you start a code review or if you open a pull request, you have to actually, you can actually ask for code reviews. So GitHub offers a nice feature on the right side where you can actually select who should review that pull request. Sometimes GitHub makes even suggestions. So suggested reviews are actually pre-selected by GitHub. That is typically done based on who contributed to that repository in the past, which is in many cases a good idea, but not always the perfect idea, because some people also are inactive now or might not actually have the time to work on that. So if you, for example, see, okay, you selected one of the main developers on that pipeline as a review, but nothing happens for 2 days. There's also the possibility, for example, to ask in the Slack channel on nfcore a request review and just point to the pull request that you just opened and ask for another review. It's also a good idea to ask people with expertise on that pipeline. So if you, for example, know that there's a couple of people on the direct pipeline who know exactly about the mapping method that you want to add it, then it might be a good idea to also ask them for a review, because they might be experts on the topic and then be able to actually judge what you did to be good or could be improved. But it's always important to also give beginners a chance too. Everyone in the nfcore community can review. It's just a good idea to jointly do that with somebody with experience on the particular pipeline maybe. So it should maybe be a co-review in the beginning until people feel confident that they can actually understand the full pipeline. Do not add too many reviews. So for example, it's also usually there's a sweet spot. So if you have 2 to 3 people, or even I would say 3, 4 is also fine. But if you have more than 5 reviewers, it tends to get very crowded and very messy as well, because there's different opinions on certain topics as well. You might end up having a really bad time actually amending all the changes that the reviewers played back to you in the end. So maybe start with 2 to 3, and if nothing happens, you can still add more people in the end. A more general thing that I think is also applying in general to the nfcore community: always show respect, be nice to people. There might be people who have very few time to work on your review, so try to be nice also to beginners, and apply some common sense in terms of that when connecting with people doing both reviewing and coding. Honestly, I also have to say, don't do a so-called German, we would say Gefälligkeitsgutachten. You should never do a review if you're not entirely sure you can cover the entire code piece, or whether, yeah, you don't have the time, for example, to work on it in full time for at least a couple of minutes to invest the time to actually do it properly, because that doesn't help the person on the other side working on the pull request too much. It's rather difficult then for them to implement the changes, because you might not find anything, or you might just find 2 typos and not being going through the entire code. So it's a good idea to actually either do it properly or just leave it be. I have to live up to that standard as well myself in some cases, but I think it's a good idea to either do it properly or just leave it be. I also wanted to point out to our code of conduct which also applies to the entire process in nfcore. Yeah. Yeah, I think with that, I'd like to finish because we're probably already running out of time. Yes.